The fluorescent lights hummed their tired 3 a.m. song as Margaret Walsh moved through the ICU supply closet with the silence of someone who'd learned to vanish. Her hands knew the muscle memory without her mind's permission, restocking 4 lines, checking expiration dates, each movement precise as a surgeon's. The slight limp in her left leg barely registered anymore, 8 years of practice making the scar tissue beneath her scrubs irrelevant. She wore the invisibility-like armor. Seattle General's overnight shift was her kingdom of quiet. 2 years working these hallways, 2 years of nobody asking questions, 2 years of keeping her head down and her past locked in a locker with only one photograph she never looked at directly. The dog tag on the broken chain beneath her scrubs caught the fluorescent light as she reached for sterile gauze packages, the metal worn smooth from 8 years of touching it. Once before every shift. Never more. That was the ritual. At 3:17 a.m., the moment changed. Dr. Ashford stood in the medication alcove near room 347, backlit by the pale blue glow of the computer screen. He was switching charts. Margaret could see the movement from her angle in the supply closet, his hand sliding a medication file from one slot to another with the ease of someone who'd done this before. The careful precision of institutional theft. Room 347 held the Marine General, 3 bullet wounds, still sedated, still trusting the hospital to keep him alive. Room 351 held Mr. Chen, 74 years old, on dialysis, his potassium levels already climbing. Margaret had checked his chart an hour ago. Potassium levels that high would kill a healthy heart. Would absolutely destroy a cardiac case already traumatized by gunshots. She froze. The gauze package hung in her hand like a question mark. Dr. Ashford turned. Their eyes met through the wire shelf gaps, past the stacked bottles of saline and the rows of vacuum-sealed equipment. He was tall, silver-haired at 56, the kind of arrogant that money and position had given him a lifetime to perfect. He wore his white coat like a crown. When he saw her watching him, he didn't rush. He didn't panic. He smiled. That was the worst part. The smile that said he already knew what she'd do about it. The smile that said she was just a night shift nurse who nobody listened to anyway. The smile was a threat wrapped in politeness. Margaret set the gauze down. She didn't move. She didn't reach for her phone or turn to find help. She stood very still in the supply closet at 3:17 a.m. and memorized the angle of his shoulders, the precise position of the medication charts, the way his fingers lingered on room 347's file like a pianist touching piano keys. This was the moment. She understood it immediately. Some moments are earthquakes dressed as paper shuffling. She said nothing. Dr. Ashford straightened his white coat, tucked the misplaced chart back, slightly, a gesture of moving it to a different wrong location, and walked past the supply closet without acknowledging her again. His shoes clicked on the tile floor, 1, 2, 3, 4 measured steps. A tank idling in a garage, all power and no hurry. Margaret stood alone with the realization that the man had just poisoned a patient and assumed she'd do nothing about it. The night continued. She finished restocking. She checked on the patients in the ICU, her hands moving through their care routines with the automatic precision of someone who'd once performed surgery in sandstorms. Room 347's general still slept, still healing, still unaware that his medication was about to kill him. She walked past him at 3:41 a.m. and looked at his face for exactly 2 seconds, the kind of glance that a nurse gives 50 times a shift, professional and distant. He was older, maybe 60, with the lean jaw of someone who'd spent decades giving orders. There was something about the shape of his eyes that made her chest tighten. 3 years. 3 years since Tikrit. 3 years since she'd received a folded flag and a letter from a Marine general named James Madon, expressing his condolences about Lance Corporal David Walsh, her son, who'd been killed by a mortar round while serving as a medic in the Jolon district. The letter had been handwritten. That was the part she remembered most vividly, the actual pen strokes, the way the general's hand had shaken slightly on the words "exceptional service" and "tremendous loss." She'd read it once. Never again. Her hands moved mechanically through the rest of the shift. Vitals. Charting. The endless small tasks that kept people breathing while they healed or while they died. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and coffee and the unique perfume of machines keeping humans alive despite their worst efforts to destroy themselves. At 6:02 a.m., as the day shift was arriving, the hospital PA system crackled to life with the sound of someone clearing their throat. Margaret was at the nurse's station, finishing charting, when the voice came through, "Nurse Maggie to administration." Nurse Maggie to administration. The entire floor turned. Maggie. The nickname nobody had permission to use. The diminishment of Margaret into something smaller, something less. The whole station went quiet, that particular silence of people recognizing a name being called like an insult. The day shift nurses traded glances. The respiratory therapist pretended to check equipment. Even the machine seemed to lower their beeping. Margaret saved her notes without reading them back. She didn't look up. She simply closed the electronic chart and stood, a scrub shifting with the movement, the dog tag shifting beneath the fabric where nobody could see it. When she turned to walk toward administration, she moved with the same invisible quality she perfected over 2 years, the quality that had kept her invisible for 8 years before that. Not hiding. Simply not demanding space. She'd walked 12 steps toward administration when Dr. Ashford appeared at the end of the hallway, moving toward her with the casual ownership of someone who controlled every floor he walked on. Behind him, she could see 2 hospital administrators she recognized from rare all-staff meetings. They were dressed formally. This was planned. This was the next stage. Dr. Ashford's voice came first, pitched loud enough for everyone to hear. "Maggie, we need to discuss some concerning performance issues from your overnight shift." She said nothing. "Perhaps somewhere private would be better," he continued, and his hand gestured toward the supply closet where she'd been standing just hours ago. The supply closet where she'd seen him switch the medication charts. His hand on the door handle made it clear this wasn't an invitation. This was a command disguised as a request. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was understanding, in that moment, that he wasn't worried about her. He wasn't concerned or desperate or threatened. He was simply executing a plan. Moving through steps. She was being handled like someone who'd already been decided about, someone whose testimony had already been dismissed, someone whose word carried no weight against his position. Margaret followed him into the supply closet where the fluorescent lights buzzed like insects in a jar. The supply closet door swung shut behind her with a pneumatic hiss, trapping the antiseptic smell of bleach and cardboard boxes in the dim fluorescent glow. Dr. Ashford stood between her and the exit, his hand still on the door handle, standing close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath, not the hospital coffee, something expensive from outside, from his world. Margaret's shoulders remained level. Her breathing stayed even. "You were in the ICU at an unusual hour, Maggie." His voice carried the texture of practiced concern, the kind that slides over surfaces without sticking. "I'm concerned about your judgment." She took one measured breath through her nose. Composure was muscle memory. "I was restocking per the overnight protocol, Dr. Ashford." "Restocking." He smiled without warmth, the expression like a wolf showing its teeth. "At 3 in the morning. In the general's room specifically. Standard rounds include the ICU, sir." He stepped closer. His badge caught the light, gold lettering, Chief of Surgical Services, and she understood in that moment that he was testing her, measuring how much she knew, calculating whether she'd seen what he'd prepared in that medication room. The silence stretched like a taut wire. 5 seconds. 6. "You're being transferred to pediatrics effective immediately," he said, each word dropping like stones into still water. "Your performance has been concerning. Documentation will follow, but the decision is final. You're to report to the 3rd floor nursing station at your next shift. Your ICU access is being revoked today." One tear escaped before she could stop it, not from fear, but from the clarity of it, the terrible arithmetic of his competence. He'd already calculated every move. Already scheduled the transfer. Already prepared the paperwork. She wiped the tear away without breaking eye contact, her jaw tight as a clenched fist. My son served under men who understood the difference between honor and power, she said quietly, her voice steady as a surgical blade. I know what integrity looks like, Dr. Ashford. This isn't it. Something shifted in his face. A recalibration. He stepped back, his hand finally leaving the door handle, and she understood she'd said exactly enough, not too much, not too little, just enough to make him wonder if she'd actually seen something. His eyes narrowed. Don't make this worse for yourself. She walked past him, her posture unchanged, her hand steady as she reached for the door. The hallway beyond was already filling with the morning shift, nurses arriving with coffee cups and tired eyes, unaware of anything. She clocked out at 7 in the morning after signing out her restricted badge, pediatrics access only now, the security guard noting it without comment. The parking lot sprawled before her in the grey Norfolk dawn, rain starting to fall in that heavy Atlantic way that made the asphalt shine like wet graphite. Her 15-year-old Honda waited where she'd parked it 12 hours earlier. She could feel her shift ending, could feel the structure of the hospital releasing her like a hand unclenching. She'd made it through, maintained her composure, kept the mask in place. Then she heard his voice behind her, louder now, staged for an audience. Nurse Walsh. A word, please. 2 administrators flanked him, she recognized them from hospital-wide calls, though she'd never spoken to either, and his voice had shifted into the register he used for meetings, the tone that carried authority like a sharp-edged tool. The arriving day shift was pulling into the parking lot now, nurses stepping out of their cars, their attention drawn by the staging of it, the public nature of the accusation. Effective immediately, Dr. Ashford announced, his words carrying across the wet asphalt to the gathering crowd, you're being reassigned to nursing assistant status due to repeated medication errors. Your credentials are under review by hospital administration. Your temporary assignment will be to support staff duties pending a formal hearing. The lie was surgical in its precision. Medication errors she'd never made. A hearing that hadn't been scheduled. Colleagues slowed their approach from their cars, watching the tableau unfold, Margaret in her scrubs, Dr. Ashford flanked by administrative weight, the rain beginning to soak through fabric. Her face remained still. Not the stillness of shock, but the stillness of someone who'd already calculated the cost and decided to pay it. She let the accusation settle, let the lie hang in the wet air, and when she spoke, her voice was calm enough to cut through the ambient noise of the parking lot. The medication errors you're referencing, do you have documentation of those incidents? His jaw tightened. She'd moved to the one place where his performance would require proof, where his narrative needed evidence. Your insubordination right now is exactly why this action is necessary. Security will process your badge revocation by end of business. She nodded once, a single acknowledgement that carried no surrender in it. Then she turned, her shoulders back, her walk neither hurried nor slow, and moved toward her sedan with her head held at the exact angle that suggested she carried something he didn't understand. The rain fell harder, soaking through her scrub top, and she didn't quicken her pace. Behind her, she could hear him still talking, explaining to the administrators, to the arriving nurses, to the entire parking lot, which meant he was still afraid. That night, alone in her apartment on Elm Street with its cracked linoleum and radiator that banged like artillery fire, Margaret found the email waiting in her inbox. Credential review notice from the Department of Nursing Services. Her ICU access had been terminated at 7:15 a.m., exactly 14 minutes after she clocked out. The pediatrics assignment was temporary pending a formal hearing. Security would contact her with the results of a full chart audit. They were investigating several potential care incidents. She opened her laptop at the kitchen table, the screen's glow the only light in the apartment. Her hands were steady as she typed. She found the dog tag on its broken chain around her neck and pulled it free, the metal cold against her palm, reading the engraving for the 10,000th time, Walsh, David J. 084-7361, OPOS. Her son's dog tag. The one she'd worn under her scrubs for 3 years. The one she never mentioned. She searched the name from the medication chart she'd photographed, General James Maddon, USMC. Service record appeared instantly, his face on the screen, scarred along the left temple, eyes that looked like they'd seen too much. Commendations cascaded down the page. Command citations. Deployment records. Tikrit, 2015. She felt her breath catch. Kandahar, 2021. Sistan Province. Her hands found the chain around her neck and held it like a lifeline. The same unit that had deployed with her son. The same general who'd signed the letter she'd received, the one she kept in a drawer. Lance Corporal Walsh died in service to his brothers. He saved lives that day. Dr. Ashford had no idea who she was. No idea that the man he was trying to kill was the one person who might be able to confirm that her son had mattered, that his death had meant something beyond the flag-folded ceremony and the benefit checks. She closed her laptop at midnight and lay in bed listening to the rain hammer the window, each drop like a small percussion instrument playing a rhythm she recognized from field camps and convoy vehicles, from a time when she'd known exactly who she was and what she was capable of. The rain kept the apartment from being completely silent, and she was grateful for that. Silence was where the memories lived. Silence was where she kept the major locked away. Her restricted access badge sat on the counter, next to a notification that the hospital board would convene in 72 hours to discuss her employment status. She'd been dismantled. Publicly. Systematically. And Dr. Ashford had done it with such methodical precision that by tomorrow, everyone at Seattle General would believe he'd discovered genuine problems with her work, genuine concerns about her stability. What he hadn't counted on was that she'd already decided to come back. Margaret didn't sleep. She'd tried, pulled the blinds at her apartment in Norfolk, set her alarm for nothing, lay in the dark watching the ceiling fan rotate like a second hand counting down to something she couldn't name. The reassignment paperwork sat on her kitchen table, already signed, effective immediately. Pediatrics. A floor where children asked why the quiet nurse limped and she'd have to smile and explain away 8 years of reconstruction. By 11 o'clock, her hands made the decision her mind was still arguing about. She grabbed her badge from the kitchen drawer, the one she hadn't returned because the human resources call hadn't come yet, and drove back to Seattle General through rain that hammered the windshield like applause for a performance no one was watching. The parking garage was empty except for the 3 a.m. shift vehicles clustered near the emergency bay. Her car settled into a space on level 2, and she sat for 30 seconds listening to the engine tick as it cooled. Muscle memory was already pulling her toward movement, the weight of her decision settling into her chest like tactical gear. The badge clipped to her scrubs as she exited the elevator, her leg protesting the quick pace but her hands already steady. She'd rebuilt those hands once, she could rebuild them again if she had to. The badge scanner at the ICU entrance would reject her. Ashford would have flagged her access the moment HR printed the reassignment order. She raised the card anyway, felt the electronic lock resist for a half second, then click. Green light. The system hadn't updated yet. Either Ashford was arrogant enough to believe she wouldn't return, or he was careful enough to assume she wouldn't dare. Both assumptions cost him. The ICU hummed with the particular quiet of 11:27 p.m., the ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythm, monitors beeped at intervals measured in seconds, and somewhere down the hall a call button chimed unanswered. Margaret moved through the threshold like water finding its level, her feet remembering the exact route to room 347, her posture settling into something that looked subservient but felt like readiness. She'd walked these corridors for 2 years pretending to be smaller than she was. Tonight she was walking them knowing exactly how small everyone else had become. The general's room was dark except for the ambient light spilling from the hallway and the soft glow of his monitors casting shadows across his face. At first, she thought he was sleeping. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow and even. The ventilator was already off, they'd extubated him that afternoon according to the chart notes she'd memorized before leaving her apartment. The 4 stands held 3 bags, normal saline, a lactated ringer drip, and something else. She froze. The label on the 3rd bag wasn't the one that should have been there. Her hand moved to the medication chart, already knowing what she'd find. The switched documentation. The fatal substitution working through his system in micrograms per hour, subtle enough that no one would notice until his organs began to fail, systemic enough that it would look like post-surgical complications. How long had it been circulating? The chart said the medication was hung at 9:14 p.m. Ashford's shift had ended at 9. He'd done it on his way out, calm and methodical, the confidence of a man who'd already won. Margaret's hand went to her phone before she realized it. 911. Report the medication error. Alert the ICU team. Get the general to emergency dialysis. Her thumb hovered over the first digit when the general's eyes snapped open. Not gradually. Not with the lazy awakening of someone pulled from sleep. His eyes opened with a sudden focus of tactical awareness, the kind that came from waking to active fire in Tikrit, from the kind of combat instinct that never fully slept even after surgery and sedation. His pupils sharpened as they tracked her position, the angle of her body, the protective stance between him and the door, the way her hand was already reaching for the fall line. She watched his gaze sweep down her frame, cataloguing the limp, the scarred left hand, the way her shoulders were positioned like someone about to move fast. Major Walsh. His voice was rough from the endotracheal tube, his breath still carrying the chemical taste of anesthesia. Not a question. A confirmation. She shook her head quickly, held a finger to her lips. The movement was automatic, military, suppress the thermal signature, kill the audio, go dark. That's not my name anymore, sir. I'm just a nurse. He tried to sit up. The movement cost him, his face went pale and his right shoulder spasmed where the surgeons had worked their repair. His hand gripped the bed rail hard enough that his knuckles went white. David's mother. The field hospital. Eureka. The old call sign landed like shrapnel. 8 years. 8 years since anyone had spoken it. 8 years of being invisible, of pushing that life into compartments sealed so deep she'd almost convinced herself they were empty. Reaper. The combat nurse who'd performed a field thoracotomy on his convoy sergeant with a combat knife because the surgical bay was 10 minutes away and the man had 3 minutes left. The field hospital in Tikrit, 2015, where she'd held the general's hand for 7 hours while his convoy sergeant died anyway, while Major David Walsh's mother had done everything in her power and it still hadn't been enough. She started to speak, to explain the medication, to warn him, to pull the four, when she heard them. Footsteps in the hallway. Multiple people. The code blue team, probably, standing down from room 351 where there was no longer an emergency. Seconds. She had maybe 5 seconds before they passed this room and saw her with her hand on the general's medication line, saw her accessing an ICU she was no longer cleared for, saw her trying to explain why a reassigned nursing assistant was committing what looked like tampering. She leaned close, her voice barely above a whisper. Sir, someone switched your medication. You're in danger. I need you to trust me and stay quiet. She watched his eyes track to her limp, to her hands, still steady despite the trembling that was happening somewhere behind her ribs where no one could see it. His nod was almost imperceptible. Military recognition. The kind of trust that existed between people who'd stood in fire together, who understood that some debts transcended rank or time. She slipped out through the bathroom connecting to the next room, an old trick, the passages between patient bays used by the night shift when they were running code and the hallways backed up. Her movement was instinctive, the patterns returning like muscle memory that had never actually forgotten. Combat movement. Security sweep. The awareness of distance and exit routes and potential threats. By the time she reached the stairwell, her phone was buzzing. Ashford. Calling her directly at 11:51 p.m. She didn't answer. The buzzing stopped, then started again. And again. She silenced it. At 2:03 a.m., she was in her car in the parking lot, her breath fogging the windshield, watching the ICU windows on the 3rd floor. Her leg throbbed where she'd pushed it hard during the walk back down to ground level. The pain was information, that's what the old trainers used to say. Pain is data. The data now was telling her that her body was breaking down, that she didn't have years left to rebuild, that every decision she made was being made with borrowed time. She saw Ashford enter the general's room. Even from the parking lot, even from 4 stories down, even in the darkness, she recognized the walk, the confidence of someone who believed he'd already won. He was carrying a syringe. The kind of syringe that would look like a scheduled medication check, like the normal overhead of ICU nursing. The kind that would shut down a compromised system faster than the medication already circulating through his veins. Her blood turned cold with the kind of certainty that came from recognizing pattern repetition. This wasn't covering up the medication error. This was finishing the job. Ashford wasn't just trying to protect himself. He was trying to complete what he'd started. The skeleton crew Ashford had scheduled meant no witnesses. The repositioned on-call surgeon meant no immediate backup. The disabled auto alert on the monitor meant time. He'd built his murder the way he'd built everything else, with precision, with confidence, with the arrogance of a man who believed he'd already accounted for every variable. From her car, she watched Ashford exit the room. Her view of his face caught the parking lot light for a moment. He was checking his watch. Buying time. The alarm hadn't sounded yet because he'd disabled the auto alert on the monitor, buying himself those crucial minutes before someone noticed the flat line. She watched him walk toward the elevators with the calm of someone who'd already calculated the chaos that would follow. By the time the code team responded, by the time they resuscitated or didn't, by the time they reviewed the records and found the medication switch, the narrative would already be written. A Marine general who'd survived 3 bullet wounds didn't survive surgery. It happened. Hospital mortality existed. No one needed to look deeper. Margaret had a choice. She could stay in the car. Stay invisible. Stay safe. The general had already sent her son home in a flag-draped coffin. Her debt was complicated. She could let this one go and no one would ask questions. She could drive away from Seattle General and Pediatrics and Norfolk and never come back. Her car door was open before the thought finished forming. She ran across the parking lot, her bad leg screaming, her badge in her hand even though it wouldn't work on ICU doors anymore. The rain hammered her shoulders like someone trying to stop her, but she was already past stopping. She was already running toward the automatic doors of the emergency bay, already moving through the lobby where the 2 a.m. skeleton crew barely looked up, already hitting the stairwell because elevators were predictable and she'd learned long ago that predictability was the fastest way to get killed. The ICU doors burst open at her palm strike. Red light flashed across her restricted badge, access denied, but the young night nurse inside had seen her frantic gestures through the double panes, had recognized the universal language of crisis, and now Margaret was through, moving past the startled tech toward room 347 where the monitors were screaming. The general lay convulsing, his body rigid against the mattress. The medication Ashford had administered was already circulating, already killing him. His cardiac rhythm dissolved into a jagged line that meant death was seconds away from becoming permanent. Margaret didn't think. Thinking was for people who had time. She ripped the poisoned foot from his arm, the plastic port tore tissue as it came free, and her hands moved to his chest, finding the landmark between his ribs, sternum and second intercostal space, the same landmark she'd learned in a combat hospital in Tikrit where the sand got into everything and the screaming never stopped. "Get me a crash cart," she said. Not a request. A command. The young nurse, her name tag read Lisa, and she couldn't have been more than 24, froze for one critical second before her body obeyed what her mind hadn't caught up to yet. Margaret was already counting compressions aloud, her voice steady as a surgical laser, each number coinciding with a downward thrust of her palms. 1, 2, 3. The general's ribs bent under her hands. Pain is data, and the data told her his sternum was cracking just right, bone yielding to pressure the way it should when someone was actually serious about bringing a body back from dead. Lisa returned with a crash cart, her hand shaking as she positioned it. "You're not authorized to be," she started, but Margaret cut her off without breaking rhythm. "Then you run it. Charge to 200. The words came out flat and final. Not a question. Lisa's hands moved to the paddles, and Margaret saw the moment the young nurse understood she was following orders from someone who'd given them before, someone whose voice carried the weight of having been obeyed at cost of blood and lives. The defibrillator whined, charging up to 200 joules. Margaret shifted position, tilted the general's head back, and Lisa placed the paddles against his chest. Clear. Margaret pulled her hands back. The general's body arched once, convulsed, and fell still. She watched the monitor. Nothing. Asystole. Flat line. She resumed compressions, harder this time, feeling the ribs flex under her palms with a kind of pain that meant she was doing damage in service of life, which was the only damage that mattered. Run 2 of epi, she said. Lisa's fingers fumbled through the crash cart, found the 1 milligram vial of epinephrine, loaded the 4 push with the kind of urgency that came from watching someone die on your hands. The medication went in and Margaret felt the subtle resistance of the 4 line accepting it, the way all the systems in a human body were just conduits and chambers, just pipes carrying chemicals that meant the difference between continuation and cessation. Her eye stayed on the 3 separate 4 lines she'd managed to establish, 1 peripheral in the general's left arm for fluids, 1 in his right for medications, 1 central line she'd threaded with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this in a field hospital while mortars shook the walls and made the lights flicker like dying fireflies. 8 minutes. That's what she had. That's what the human brain could survive without oxygen before the damage became permanent, became resurrection without actually returning, a body that breathed but a mind already dead. 6 minutes had probably already passed. She was working in the narrow window between life and the permanent kind of gone. The monitor showed nothing for another 30 seconds. Then a blip. A single electrical impulse, like someone knocking on a door from inside a sealed room. Margaret felt Lisa's breath catch beside her. Another blip. Then rhythm. Sinus rhythm, steady and present, the electrical song that meant a heart was choosing to beat again. The general's chest rose on its own, the ventilator picking up the signal from his returning nervous system and synchronizing with his breathing. Margaret stepped back. Her hands were covered in his blood where she'd ripped out the poisoned 4, where the needle had torn tissue on its way out. The monitors hummed their steady song. The ICU around them remained perfectly, impossibly silent, no code team crashing through the doors, no attending physician, no backup. Ashford had orchestrated it. She understood that now with the clarity of someone who'd seen strategy used as a weapon. He'd scheduled the night staff down to skeleton crew. He'd pulled the on-call surgeon for mandatory training. He'd made sure that if something went wrong with his lethal injection, no one would arrive in time to interfere. The door slammed open like a gunshot. Dr. Ashford stood in the threshold with 2 security officers flanking him, his phone already pressed to his ear, his voice already speaking to someone with authority higher than hers in every way that mattered in this building. Security, remove this woman immediately. She's been terminated and is trespassing in a restricted area. His composure was perfect. Surgical. Strategic. The voice of someone who'd already prepared his narrative, already had his next move chambered and ready to fire. Margaret stepped back from the bed, hands raised in the universal gesture of surrender. Blood dripped from her palms onto the polished floor. The general's eyes were open now, watching her over the oxygen mask, his gaze sharp and present and full of recognition. Not the confusion of someone returning from unconsciousness. The understanding of someone who'd just watched his would-be assassin get interrupted. He was in cardiac arrest, Margaret said quietly. The medication you administered is exactly what I prescribed, Ashford interrupted, his voice smooth as glass. And your presence here, after explicit termination and restriction, constitutes criminal trespassing. Officers? The 2 security guards moved forward, and Margaret recognized Steve, who worked the North Corridor, who'd said hello to her for 2 years in the casual way people did when they passed each other 1,000 times without really seeing. She saw the moment of hesitation cross his face, the instant where his eyes registered that something was wrong with this equation. Then his training reasserted itself. Protocol. Authority. The hierarchy that meant Ashford was above her in every structural sense. I'm sorry, but we need you to come with us, Steve said, and there was genuine regret in his voice, which somehow made it worse than if he'd been cruel. Margaret looked back at the general one last time. His monitor showed a steady 68 beats per minute. Sinus rhythm. Oxygenation saturation at 96%. Blood pressure climbing. My son would have done the same thing, she said, more to the room than to anyone in it, and then she let the security officers guide her toward the door while Ashford's phone conversation continued behind her, his voice already reframing this as her violation, her unauthorized entry, her trespassing in a restricted area. The morning came grey and cold, the kind of Norfolk dawn that felt like punishment. Margaret stood in the hospital laundry facility at 5:30 a.m., the fluorescent lights humming their tired song, and folded her scrubs one final time. The blue fabric was institutional, unreplaceable, and utterly anonymous. She creased it with the precision of someone who'd folded bandages and field medical supplies in conditions where precision meant the difference between a wound that healed and one that killed, muscle memory from Tikrit translating into perfect hospital corners for fabric that would never touch her skin again. The name tag, M. Walsh, RN, caught the fluorescent light as she peeled it free. She held it for a moment, this small piece of plastic that had authorized her to be in rooms where people died and were brought back to life, and then she placed it in the bin with all the others, anonymous now, indistinguishable from every other discarded credential. The laundry attendant, a woman named Dorothy who'd worked in this basement for 23 years without ever complaining, took the folded scrubs without comment. But she squeezed Margaret's hand once, a gesture that said she saw, that she knew something was wrong with how this had happened, that she understood the shape of injustice even if she couldn't articulate it out loud. Margaret walked back up the stairs, through the lobby where the night shift was giving report to the day shift, past the ICU where the general was probably already awake and coherent, past Dr. Ashford's office where he would arrive in a few hours to plan his next strategic move, secure in the knowledge that he'd neutralized the threat, removed the problem, solved the Margaret Walsh situation with precision and authority and institutional advantage. Her hand found the dog tag around her neck, the single metal rectangle on a broken chain that she'd carried since the day a Marine general had pressed it into her palm in a field hospital in Tikrit while her son's body was still warm in the adjacent tent. She held it there, over her heart, as she stepped through the automatic doors into the grey morning. Her phone buzzed. A news alert. Dr. Ashford was scheduled for a live television interview at noon. Maintaining hospital standards. The promotional footage showed a pixelated face, unidentifiable but recognizable, a name partially obscured but clear enough for anyone who'd been paying attention. Margaret was packing boxes in her apartment when her phone lit up with a news alert. Local station. Live interview. Dr. Ashford discussing hospital standards, removing unqualified staff. She reached for the remote to turn it off when the studio phone line rang on air, and the anchor's voice cut through the studio chatter. "We have General James Mad Don calling in from Walter Reed Medical Center." The patient himself. Voice rough from intubation, but steady. Margaret's breath caught. "That nurse you're slandering saved my life twice," the general said, each word a blade. The first time was in Tikrit in 2015 when Major Margaret Walsh performed a field thoracotomy on my convoy under fire. Cut open my chest with a combat knife while rounds were hitting the Humvee. Kept me breathing until the medevac arrived. Margaret pressed her palm against her scarred thigh, the shrapnel wound that ended her field medicine career. She didn't realize her hands were shaking until she set down her coffee mug. The camera caught Ashford's face draining of color like someone had opened a valve. He tried to maintain his practiced composure, but his jaw clenched visibly. The general continued, his voice taking on the weight of command. "The second time was 4 nights ago when she recognized someone had tampered with my medication. Someone switched my chart. Someone tried to finish what that convoy attack started." Silence in the studio. The kind of silence that preceded court-martials and prison sentences. "I'm told the FBI is very interested in talking to Dr. Ashford about that," the general said. "About the Shell Corporation payments. About why his offshore account received $847,000 the week before my hospitalization." Margaret's phone buzzed, hospital staff texting her, watching the same broadcast. The young night nurse, 3 shocked face emojis. Security guard Steve, "Holy shit. Ashford stood abruptly, knocking his microphone. The sound screamed through the speakers, feedback and metal clattering on studio floor. He tried to walk off set, but federal agents rose from chairs behind him, moving with the fluid precision of apex predators. One held up credentials, FBI badge catching studio lights. Another officer spoke into a radio clipped to his vest. The anchor pivoted smoothly, her professional instincts overriding shock. "Dr. Ashford, these gentlemen say they need to speak with you about." "I have nothing to say without my attorney." Ashford's voice was sharp now, the smooth hospital politician stripped away, exposing raw panic underneath. One agent read from a document, medication protocols for a federal witness under protection, and financial records showing payments from a shell corporation linked to the Kandahar attack network. Margaret's coffee grew cold in her hands. It wasn't malpractice. It was assassination. Contracted. Paid for. Dr. Ashford hadn't just tried to murder the general out of malice, someone had hired him. Someone with money and reach and a reason to want a Marine general dead before he could testify about overseas corruption. The agents didn't cuff Ashford. Not yet. But they escorted him out of the studio with the kind of measured control that meant career ending. His face had gone the color of hospital bleach. The camera held on him until he disappeared through the studio doors, his tie slightly askew, his carefully constructed authority evaporating in real time. The anchor smoothly transitioned to a split screen, studio chaos on one side, a Pentagon spokesperson on the other, confirming that General James Mad Don was indeed a protected federal witness scheduled to testify about corruption in overseas defense contracting. $17 billion in suspicious payments. 34 officers implicated. An international ring that reached from Arlington to 3 different countries. Margaret's phone exploded with notifications. Colleagues apologizing. Nurses she'd worked with for 2 years suddenly remembering her name. The hospital security team asking if she was safe. Even people from her physical therapy group, somehow watching the same broadcast and piecing together that the quiet woman who never talked about her past had just been exonerated in front of 3 million viewers. The news cut to coverage of Seattle General, reporters descending on the main entrance, federal agents sealing Ashford's office with yellow tape marked federal investigation. Hospital board members emerging and immediately refusing comment, their faces twisted between outrage and damage control. By evening, footage surfaced of Ashford in handcuffs being walked out of the FBI field office downtown. His attorney in a charcoal suit read a brief no-comment statement while Ashford stared at the cameras with hollow eyes, the look of someone whose strategic competence had just collapsed entirely. His resources gone. His allies scattered. His career atomized by a single phone call from a recovering general with nothing left to lose. Margaret's phone rang. The hospital CEO, voice tight with apology and fear, "Major Walsh, I need you to know the hospital board was completely unaware of the circumstances surrounding your termination. We're conducting a full investigation. Dr. Ashford has been placed on immediate administrative leave pending." Margaret heard commotion in the background. Voices. Movement. "Hold please." The line filled with hold music, something classical and useless. On her television, still streaming the interview, Margaret watched the anchor cut to breaking news. The FBI had filed charges. Attempted murder. Conspiracy. Wire fraud involving federal protection witness protocols. The CEO returned, "Your credentials are being restored immediately. Full back pay, retroactive to the day of your termination. And we'd like to discuss a new position. Director of a Veteran Services Program. We want to honor the staff who've served, and after what happened with Dr. Ashford, we need someone with your background leading that initiative." Margaret barely heard the words. She was watching Ashford's face on screen as he realized, truly realized, that his entire existence had just been dismantled. The next morning, Margaret showered, dressed in her one pair of dark jeans and the blue blouse she'd owned for 7 years, and drove to Seattle General. The parking lot was different now, cameras from news vans still circling, but something else too. Staff members stopping to look at her as she walked past. Not whispers anymore. Recognition. The young night nurse who'd helped her 4 days ago, the one who'd understood without being told to keep quiet, practically ran toward her in the hallway. "Major Walsh, oh my God, everyone's talking about what you did. What you've done." "Your son," Margaret raised one hand gently, not to silence her, but to acknowledge the weight of what the girl was saying. "Show me where we're setting up the new program," she said instead. The offices they'd cleared out were on the 4th floor, administrative spaces that had been empty since budget cuts the previous year. Margaret walked past Dr. Ashford's old office. Yellow tape across the door. The nameplate already removed, leaving a rectangle of unfaded paint on the polished wood. Inside, through the glass, she could see the desk empty except for evidence markers and a single manila folder. She didn't look back. The Veteran Services Wing took shape over the following days. Photos of staff members in uniform lined the hallway. Margaret allowed her own silver stars to be framed and displayed, the 2 medals catching light from the skyway windows. Her purple heart hung beside them. After 8 years of letting people forget she'd ever been anything but a quiet nurse pushing a medication cart. After 8 years of carrying David's dog tag hidden under her scrubs like a secret that might burn through the fabric. On the 7th day, the general was discharged. But before he left, he requested one final meeting in his recovery room. Margaret found him sitting up, reviewing documents, probably discharge paperwork, probably notes about his testimony scheduled for the following month. When she entered, he looked up and his face did something that took her by surprise. He smiled. Not the grateful smile of a patient. The smile of a commanding officer recognizing a subordinate's valor. "Major," he said, and she realized she wasn't correcting the rank anymore. She'd earned it back. "General." She sat in the bedside chair, the one where she'd sat for 3 nights monitoring his vitals, checking his breathing, making sure the medication flowing into his veins was what it was supposed to be. They sat in silence for a moment, the kind of silence that only exists between people who've seen combat together, who understand what the other has survived. Then the general reached into his jacket. His hand emerged holding a small box, worn leather, the kind of thing that had traveled through years. Through wars. Through field hospitals and triage tents and the weight of impossible choices. "I found this in the field hospital rubble after the mortar attack," he said quietly. "After we lost your son. After I watched him bleed out on a surgical table while you worked on 3 other casualties. It took me 8 years to connect the name on the chart, Major M. Walsh, with the quiet ICU nurse they said was transferred." He opened the box. Inside, on a chain so damaged the links looked fractured, was a single military dog tag. Not his. Not the general's. David's. The engraving still legible, D. The Walsh, LCPL, USMC. Margaret's vision blurred. She didn't trust her hands to reach for it. "You were wearing 2 tags when the mortar hit," the general continued. "One for you. One for your son, the way mothers in our military sometimes do. This one flew off in the blast. Landed near the triage area. I kept it, not knowing who to return it to, but knowing someone should have it back." He placed the box in her hands. "He asked me to tell you something. At the end. When he knew it wasn't going to be okay. He asked me to tell his mother that watching you work in that field hospital was the proudest moment of his life. That you taught him what it meant to serve." Margaret's hand shook as she lifted the tag from the box. The chain was indeed broken, bent and twisted from whatever force had torn it from around David's neck. But the engraving was clear. His name. His service number. His blood type. A positive. The same as hers. She reached up and unclasped her own dog tag chain, the one she'd worn continuously for 8 years. 2 tags, one bearing her own information and the other a duplicate of David's, because she couldn't bear to let him be forgotten even when no one knew who she really was. She placed her own tag in the general's hand. "Reaper," she said quietly. "The call sign he gave me. Not a question. A statement. A sharing of something sacred between those who understood that names meant more than letters on metal." The general nodded, understanding the gesture, a profound exchange of honor. She threaded the recovered tag onto her chain, completing what the mortar attack had separated. 3 tags now: David's original, David's duplicate, and her own. A family of service that nothing, not bombs or betrayal or 8 years of silence, could completely sever. The Pentagon is creating a new combat medic training program, the general said as he prepared to leave her office, his discharge paperwork signed. They asked me to recommend a director. Someone who understands field medicine at the highest level. Someone the troops would trust. He paused at her office door. I gave them your name, Major. Margaret looked at the dog tags in her hands. Both of David's names, finally together. I'll think about it, sir, she said. After he left, she walked to the ICU window overlooking room 347, the room where everything had changed, where a quiet nurse had stopped being invisible. The young night nurse was inside now, training in emergency medicine under Margaret's mentorship, learning not just the protocols but the humanity that made the difference between a patient and a person. The nurse looked up and saw her watching, and waved. Margaret touched the dog tags hanging from her neck, both names resting together for the first time in years. Her phone buzzed, the hospital CEO confirming that the board had approved her appointment as Director of Veteran Services and Combat Medicine Integration, effective immediately. They were asking her to speak at a ceremony next week, honoring all veteran staff members. This time, she wouldn't stay invisible. She opened her laptop and began writing, the words coming easier now. My name is Major Margaret Walsh. And I want to tell you about my son, and what it means to serve, and why the quietest people in hospitals sometimes carry the heaviest weight. 3 months later, Margaret received a tip from a colleague working in the downtown business district. Dr. Ashford was selling supplemental insurance from a folding table outside a strip mall in Norfolk, conviction pending sentencing. She drove past once. Just once. Watched through the glass window as he sat in a folding chair, a banner reading supplemental insurance, asked me how, drooping from the table edge. His tie was wrinkled. His eyes were the color of ash. A woman walked past without making eye contact. He straightened the banner and waited for the next customer who wouldn't come. Margaret didn't feel satisfaction. She felt something quieter. The understanding that justice doesn't always look like triumph. Sometimes it looks like a man in a folding chair, finally facing what his arrogance had cost. Margaret's office at Seattle General overlooked the ICU. On her desk sat a photograph, David in dress blues, 19 forever, smiling at something the camera couldn't capture. Beside it, on a chain that had been professionally repaired by a jeweler who didn't ask questions, hung 3 military dog tags. Her own. David's original. David's recovered. 2 silver stars hung on the wall. A purple heart. A Navy cross. And finally, after 8 years of hiding who she really was, her commission as Major, framed and visible. The ceremony took place on a Wednesday afternoon. Margaret stood before 37 veteran staff members, former Marines, Navy medics, Army nurses, a SEAL who now ran the PT department, 3 pilots who transitioned to administrative roles. She told them about Tikrit. About the weight of a surgical knife in a combat zone. About her son who'd served beside her and taught her what sacrifice actually meant. About staying invisible until invisibility became not a choice but a suffocation. And about the moment when staying quiet cost someone else's life, and she had to decide whether 8 years of silence was worth one more person dying. The room was absolutely still. No one moved. No one breathed. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical drone, and underneath it, Margaret's voice, steady, clear, no longer deferential, carried the weight of every decision she'd made and every person she'd saved. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns, she said. And sometimes the most important thing you can do is make sure everyone knows your name. Subscribe to hear more stories of hidden heroes. Like and comment if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your real strength. Because the quietest people in the room might just be the ones holding it all together.